This recording is based on, I guess, I actually wanted to call into a radio station, a talk radio station, and what is the slogan that they use? Join the conversation. I'm afraid the conversation might be too toxic for it to permit any real contrary or, according to its own frame of reference, controversial contradiction of its ideological line and agenda, as all journalism has moved into that category. And as is often the case with corrupted moral systems, uh, the first thing they have to do is secure their own, let's say, ideological grounding, which means essentially to be highly hysterical and aggressively, sort of preemptively issuing uh, 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 grand polemics that make it impossible to even have a debate about their own substantiation. You know, they are this kind of autistic form of ideological uh, uh, self-fueling sort of mafia protection racket, and even socially and in a managerial and bureaucratic system in which this ideology has already taken hold and infected, it becomes impossible to to actually have real um, discussion about it because it's so brittle and vulnerable. It's so unwilling to allow itself to be challenged or have to substantiate itself properly, except in forums where it effectively holds the chairmanship and it holds essentially the gatekeeping role. So effectively it can tailor, it can editorialize post hoc. You know, it can sort of selectively edit even the history of the discourse itself. They can selectively reinterpret, recontextualize subjects that are brought up and spoken about. They can add these layers of interpretation onto reality. They give themselves these unilateral powers. It's almost like an ideological form of a personality disorder. Um, Now, I actually wanted to phone in and talk about COVID, but there was actually something that was being spoken about, which was right at the end of the program, where I'm not sure if this person is well known or not, talking about someone who had stopped using Twitter or something like that. And it was interesting listening to John Maytham, the things that he said about that, because I would consider him and his organization and to be guilty of the sorts of general cultural commentary that he was making, at least about Twitter. Um, Quite ironic. And anyway, what I want to focus on is really to do with the journalistic coverage of COVID and its failings, and how journalism in general as an institution is dead in our culture. Um, I mean, so, you know, the only thing that exists now is agenda driven journalism. Uh, and the kind of manufactured moral panic which anti-racism ideology is premised in and requires in order to just kind of validate itself and to keep itself afloat. You can see how then the whole moral corruption and the whole general impoverishment of discourse in general and freedom of speech in general makes it impossible, because of the ideological filter on that freedom of speech, in order to sort of perpetuate this kind of this moral panic that makes anti-racism ideology plausible and serviceable and seemingly sensible in in that crazy context of a kind of perpetual civil war, of a kind of systemic conspiracy against certain identitarian factions, while ironically they are systemically employing systems of administration which are effectively exactly what they complain about. It is certainly ironic that ostensibly what they claim to combat is exactly what they propose to enforce as the solution. So it's weird that essentially their solution is the inverse of the problem that they talk about. Or when I say inverse, I mean that it's not that it's the same thing. It's the same thing. It's just the mirror reflection of it. And so that kind of disgusting balancing act that, it's not racism when we do it, it's the solution when we do it, as their disgusting fascist program unfolds and as it continues to self-debase and self-degenerate in a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, in that it ends up making its narrative true, and its narrative, which is very poorly constructed out of effectively lies, and statistics, and statistics that are so badly framed. I mean, the level of intellectualism in how they construct their narrative is so mediocre. It's hardly. I'm not going to go through all the ways in which it's just utterly pretentious pseudo-intellectual trash. But I mean, you can just look at Bret Weinstein's Black Intellectual Roundtable, where you have many people talking about just how ludicrous and absurd many of these claims are. And the kinds of ideological constructs that come from this sort of anti-racist, so-called anti-racist intellectual cesspool. But I guess it is also, though, slightly, within that Black Intellectual Roundtable, there were two people who I would say were quite obviously the most intellectually vacuous contributors to that Black Intellectual Roundtable, which were those who, the guy right in the middle, just basically cooing along with the grand polemic slogans, essentially, and not able to join the fray because you can't defend those kinds of narrative claims. They're just essentially asserted into reality. They're just interpreted there from a moral framework that already presupposes racial essentialism, effectively. A kind of disgusting intellectual sympathy with that, well, this is the easiest form of the solution, so we should just get on board with this kind of blanket stereotyped racism, essentially, because that's the way to fix things, is to treat people as groups and to give them ideological categorical designations and to perpetuate a kind of ongoing systemic moral corruption, because supposedly that's the convenient and efficient way of organizing the solution. These are the kinds of shortcuts that natural fascists in their thinking are naturally predisposed into, that because they can imagine themselves as being the field marshal of that kind of moral rhetoric, of that kind of poisonous moral rhetoric, which we see everywhere now in how it's been normalized. But you can see that status quo of moral panic, how it has affected COVID-19 in terms of its coverage by journalists, who are so used to pandering to this kind of moral outrage and delivering to it its strict diet of what it needs to reproduce its cocoon of ideological, it's interesting, though, also that the class of people who believe in this kind of trash, of this kind of pseudo-intellectual trash, you have to be indoctrinated into it. You have to sort of go to a university or be taught it by your teachers in school, as it now is spreading from, which it has spread from academia. But anyway, it has to be mouthed by everyone. It has to become the kind of the smart consensus. You have to have people like the Chief Justice repeating this kind of ideological trash and the betrayal of the fundamental values in the Constitution. It's the only way that it gets by, is by promulgating itself everywhere and anywhere that it can, and enforcing its disgusting administration and ad hoc treatment of people according to these general grand polemic categorizations of reality, which reality never fits into, but you just make it fit, and then you make people apologize, and you make people, you know, in you make people sign things, you make people declare things about their how they're doing about dealing with their internalized white privilege, or whatever bullshit it is that week or that month. Um, and it's such a diversion from actually dealing with any real tangible problem, because it becomes the problem of the identity, which becomes what the political project becomes about, which means that you can't have normal politics, you can't have any kind of intelligent discussion of policy. Okay, anyway, that's on that side of the fence. Let's look at COVID-19. So I think the problem is that journalism themselves, being acclimatized to that form of activism and agenda-based journalism, they can't actually really investigate anything anymore. Essentially, they can only investigate harshly in a partisan manner to prove that they're still journalists. They will go after the enemies of their ideological agenda. And so that's where essentially only half of reality gets any kind of, passes any kind of muster or any kind of rigorous investigation. And that sort of investigation is like a kind of a witch hunt anyway. It's not even properly conducted. So you get this highly partisan, brittle kind of disgusting journalism. And mostly, it's just sycophants that are trying to promote this kind of this group morality, this group think, essentially, and they're trying to entrench it and to forward its purpose. So, I mean, I don't even think it should be called journalism. It should just be called ideological propaganda at this point. But anyway, so you can see that then when confronted with a real issue, there is just, well, what is the party line? What is the ideological line on this issue? And then they just have to blindly follow that line. Even John Maytham himself was confronted with, this was near the beginning, I think, of the lockdown, or even or just before it, I can't remember. He was talking to a local health expert. I don't know if it was an epidemiologist or it was someone from UCT or something like that. And only at the very end of the interview did he say, well, actually, it would actually be better if the virus was moving a bit faster through the population, because we've got a lot of spare capacity in the hospitals which isn't being used. And essentially it would be better if the virus could be spreading a little bit faster, so that we could essentially get through this a bit faster. And that only happened at the end of the interview. And essentially, I don't think that they made any real connection with John Maytham, because it was just so far beyond the party line, the ideological line on this issue, on this crisis, on this moral panic. And that could not be, properly, I mean, that should have almost been the center of the interview. That should have been perhaps discovered at the start, and sort of and debunking all of the crazy thinking and the illogical strategy that has been employed to deal with COVID-19. And I'm going to go into that. There are two experts that I'm mainly that I could say basically mirrors the things that I'm about to go into, which is Professor Leonidas from Stanford and Professor Gupta from Oxford, who right in January were talking about things and the likeliness of certain things, and everything that they've said has proven out to be the case. And essentially all the bad policy that has come around COVID-19 has been because of the Imperial College study, which is such a poor study, which is such a trash study. It will never be peer reviewed, because and all of its presumptions that it's based on were all utter nonsense and conjecture, and were even regarded by, let's say, the real experts to be such trash that it should just be completely ignored, even as all of public policy has been put in line essentially with that study, which essentially assumed that all the cases that they were seeing were presenting from a virus that had just landed in the country, that the virus hadn't already been in the country for a couple of months, spreading, that it had literally just landed, and that all the cases you were seeing were basically representative greatly of the kind of the case in that these weren't just incidents presenting themselves to the medical facilities, but they were largely representative of of the majority of cases entirely. And so they've just got crazy stats. The Imperial College and this culture of creating fake statistics and bad statistics has continued. Whereas Professor Gupta has said time and time again, it's completely irresponsible for governments to publish confirmed cases. It's an irrelevant number. Don't tell people how many confirmed cases there are because you haven't been doing population-wide testing. You haven't done even samples of population testing. So what is the point of confirmed cases? How long is a piece of string? It's an utterly useless stat. It's completely misleading. It means nothing. No one knows what it means until you do population-wide testing. And now all the population-wide testing that they have done in small towns in Germany and Italy, and now Professor Leonidas has also done similar population-wide sample testing, and it shows that essentially the incidence fatality rate might be something like 6%, but the case fatality rate is like well below 0.1%. So like these are huge deviations in numbers, and the actual relevant number is the case fatality rate and not the incidence fatality rate. But journalists don't penetrate this. They don't investigate this. They don't care, essentially, because the ideological line needs to be served, and you can't break rank. You can't stick your head above the parapet. So, I mean, they're basic. I mean, you just look at Sweden as a basic thing. Now, Sweden did have one, let's say, scandal, which is that it got into the old age homes, which is a completely separable tragedy, essentially, which has even been a tragedy that happened, I think, in New York State. There was a similar kind of sort of negligent management of things. I think a similar thing happened in London. So that's a separable tragedy when these things get into the old age homes. That has nothing to do with Sweden's general strategy of letting the virus take its natural course. And letting the virus take its natural course obviously has meant that Sweden has had more cases than its neighbors, but it also has traveled much faster through the population. And essentially, I think even at the last time I heard it, 70% of the Swedish population, it's gone through 70% of the population. So if you look at the number of cases that they have, and you compare that, yes, it's more cases than in other countries. Well, in other countries, it's only gone through 30% of the population. So Sweden is much more far along in being over with it, in being through with it. The idea that you're going to track and trace, you can do that if you live in a small country in which you catch it early and you're prepared for it, essentially, and you're waiting for it to come. But in the situation and the context in which it's already landed, you're not going to eradicate it. It's the lockdown solution does not have as one of its purports eradication. Eradication is not on the table. This common notion that is almost implicitly being believed is that it's possible to eradicate this is just utterly, it's ludicrous. It's beyond absurd. The only thing you can do is slow the virus. And why would you want to slow the virus? There's only one reason to slow the virus, is because you're afraid that your medical resources are going to be overtaxed and you don't have enough spare capacity. But in the context in which you have spare capacity, you should actually be promoting the spread of the virus, except to the vulnerable population. The vulnerable population, you can potentially save a minority of people within any population from contracting this virus. The only way to do that intelligently is you tell them to essentially practice social distancing and essentially for them to have a self-imposed lockdown while everyone else essentially tries to spread the virus amongst themselves to essentially precipitate herd immunity sooner, because otherwise you're just going to have a longer lockdown period that continues who knows how long, and you're going to expect the vulnerable population to have to endure that extended period of absence and self-isolation. It's ridiculous. It's completely, it just makes no sense. It's just completely unintelligent. The idea that you're going to track and trace active cases or something like that, when we're not even doing general testing. 80% of the people who get this virus have no symptoms whatsoever. So if you're not going to track and trace them, what's the point of track and tracing the people? So I mean, I even think track and trace is I mean, obviously, if people are sick, they should be at home. They should be put apart from people, or I mean, they shouldn't be active. They shouldn't be going to their job, essentially. And so, we can mitigate, let's say, the wild, rapid sort of spread of the virus. But that's the only thing. That's the only thing that is worth mitigating. That is the only thing you can mitigate. Everything else is inevitable. People are going to come in contact with it. The only thing that you can hope to do is that the vulnerable population, you can hope to limit their contact with it. And the only way that that is sustainable is to try and get it over with, done sooner. Now, we have to remember that also COVID viruses, historically, and we know a lot about them because we've experienced them before. And so we can use that knowledge of the family of the virus to plan things intelligently. Now, we get a lot of fake news about, oh, well, antibodies might not confer immunity. Okay, that's not true about COVID viruses. So it's very incredibly unlikely that would not hold true in this case. And trying to be extra cautious and on the safe side, apart from that just being utterly contemptible, because what is the alternative, first of all? But just leveraging pure possibility is just utterly irresponsible, and it actually flies in the face of what we do know about it. And let me just say about these reports about certain people that have been reinfected. All of those cases have actually turned out to not be true. They've been largely, essentially, fake news. And also, people need to understand that immunity is not a binary of you have 100% immunity, you can't be reinfected. That's not what immunity is. Immunity, like there are many also forms of immunity as well, but immunity is largely contingent on exposure to viral load. It's almost impossible to be immune to everything or to anything in any concrete 100% way. Immunity just means that essentially, if you are exposed to a viral load that below a certain size, that essentially you won't be prone to infection. That's all it means. Doesn't mean that it's impossible for you to be infected. Again, it's just incredibly unlikely. That's how immunity works. It's actually quite similar to the notion of herd immunity in some sense. That herd immunity is very much almost like is almost a pretty good metaphor for what actually happens in an individual biological sort of thing in most cases of so-called immunity. It's not a perfect dichotomy of you have immunity, it's impossible for you to be infected, or you don't. Okay, so these are things that journalists should be doing. I shouldn't be saying this. Journalists should be saying this. Journalists should be getting into this. But instead, we have people that are conditioned to feeding the moral outrage and the moral panic. Because frankly, I think that a lot of these journalists, they are most of them now, because of this activist craze, they've also sort of acclimatized themselves to this new role in society where they see themselves as kind of like ideological field marshals, and they are they've conditioned themselves to somewhat be natural fascists, and they're part of this disgusting machine of groupthink, and they can't extricate themselves from their role, and if they do, they will be mobbed. They want to be on the right side of the mob. They're if they're not a field marshal of the mob, then perhaps they are the food, as it were. Is there anything else? Yeah, so join the conversation. Well, I think the conversation is probably too toxic to join. This particular company, I mean, I guess ever since Reddy Dureko left 567 Cape Talk, it has been a toxic environment. It is a shell of what it once was, or at least, or the potential that it held. Um, it's a parapet for this illiberal, disgusting, anti-racist, fascist, black empowerment agenda, which is essentially going to mean that we will always have corrupt politics in this country, because their moral corruption, which they pander uh, uh, to their quite toxic ideological customers or consumers, is just it's a doom spiral. It's incapable of actually self-reflection. It's incapable of measuring itself. Um, it's incapable of absorbing any criticism. It's just a doom march towards further and further destabilization. And really, its inability to actually contend with actual substantive uh, uh, disagreement. It's yeah. I guess this is what it looks like when a society is being slow cooked into fascism. Um, and I do want to keep a record of this, and I do hope that this so that historically this can be looked back on and identified for what it is, and just and how easily people essentially can fall in league with uh, you know these morally murky, slippery sloped descents. um, What I should add in the elaboration of the moral corruption that facilitates state corruption is that politicians are held to a delusional standard where essentially they just have to pander to the feelings of the mob in their moral panic and hysteria, which is essentially orchestrated by the journalism class, which you can say that they're just feeding their consumers because they have no integrity effectively. There's no institutional integrity in the function of journalism, and essentially without that kind of actual free discourse and free speech in the society, where people are sense making out loud with their speech, when institutions are gated by these ideological agendas. Essentially, you can't phone in to Cape Talk and have an anti-racist ideological bent. You'll be editorialized by whatever host is on at the time. I mean, by essentially by necessity, because if they give you play, if they let you go uninterrupted, or let's say underailed, if they let you have your say, if they let you join the conversation, they'll be berated by their colleagues. They'll be berated by their bureaucratic management. They will potentially, if they're not towing the ideological line. I mean, we have essentially a captured culture at this point, and it has been captured by this highly radical identitarian. I mean, it's a fascist ideological racket and protection game where you have to get protection from their ideological scheme. Otherwise, anything can happen to you. You can be cancelled, essentially. And the the constraint on thought is necessary because their ideology is so weak, because their intellectualism is so mediocre. They have to say, "Oh, you're just ignorant," never minding the fact that they've never actually entered into an honest, authentic debate about any of the subjects which they supposedly champion in their activism. It's built on a Tower of Babel that if they allowed authentic challenge, it would crumble in a second. It has to trade off of this very brittle currency of essentially moral, uh, this moral feeling that they have to cultivate, the lived experience which you share with your entire stereotypical group, that essentially this stereotyped way of thinking has to be so encoded into what is being projected onto reality as a constant sort of civil war in order to continually perpetuate and perpetrate this ideological inception of reality until essentially to go against that orthodoxy, to go against that dogma, you have to be destroyed. You have to be put up against the wall. You have to be taken out of decent society. You have to be removed. And and you can already see the sentiment of this. You can already see the attitude of this has already been developed. I mean, essentially, they haven't yet essentially taken over the police to make it a police state. But institutionally, from an intellectual standpoint, they have already done vast things. They have already changed values themselves. They have reinterpreted the Constitution. They have corrupted it. They have interpreted they have interpreted social justice in such a perverted way so that it means its opposite. Social justice means to them group versus group. That it's justice for the group relative to some other group. It's not justice for the individual against the whole of society that is imposing arbitrary restrictions against the individual. No. They have literally reinterpreted social justice to mean its opposite. It is so disgusting. They have defined disadvantage as essentially their racist stereotyping of where people are based on this systemic collective statistical interpretation of some kind of collective condition, so that essentially plutocratic, privileged black elites can use the poor as a human shield for their corruption and for their debasement and disintegration of the institutional structure of society itself, so that nothing can work except by the ad hoc permission granted by some middle management bureaucratic, this is the rule of man if there ever was, that there is, law itself has been contorted so that it can be administered according to this ideological poison. And essentially the identity consciousness which is required for this kind of disgusting policy to be enacted essentially becomes the emergence of this racist, of this fascist self-image and self-conception and conceptualization of society, which mirrors that self-conception. And this is what has now taken over even generally in academia, and it's so impoverished in terms of its thinking. It's so, it literally, it can't even defend itself intellectually on the substance and the content of it. It just makes blanket statements. It just makes blanket assertions. It just assumes that it is correct before it even begins to argue anything. It doesn't in fact argue anything. It just describes demands that it is entitled to because of the narrative of its systemic picture that it paints everyone into. And it's impossible to paint yourself out of that picture without being attached to all of the indictments and accusations that they have as essentially their hostage taking. It is essentially a radical totalitarian ideological corruption, and it has its thought leaders, it has its influences, and they go unchallenged and unconfronted. And so we get the slow cook fascism, which we are, living within. It's sort of 1920s Weimar Germany. That's where we are. Aryan studies, race and gender studies. What's the difference? Really, what's the difference? So Aryan studies told you that you were superior because of your genetics and your blood, whereas race and gender studies tells you that you are morally superior because of your inherited historical claim that your group inherited. there's no functional difference between these ideological worldviews. It just has slightly different details to perform the same ideological structure. You know, these people are fascists. They have corrupted the Constitution, they have betrayed its values, they have taken over, and they go unconfronted because journalism has been captured. I lay this at the feet of the culture that has allowed itself to be captured, and we deserve the corruption that we get. We do, because even if you have the most well-meaning people supposedly right at the top, if you follow this kind of moral corruption and poison, there is no way that you don't have policy that is just fundamentally corrupt. Because it does not deal with the actual challenges. It deals with the ideological challenge. It deals with the ideological challenge to the identity. And it tries to solve the crisis of identity and the problem of identity. And so the identity has gotten stronger. The black identity, no one can speak out against it. You will be crushed if you speak out against it. The identity has certainly progressed and developed. But what of the people on the ground? What of reality? What about real flesh and blood people? What has happened to them? You've had a cannibalism of people who are trying to promote opportunity and growth in this country. But no, because we have to have this racist filter on reality, you can't even progress using normal means. You can't even progress using the tried and tested methods of just natural expansion of opportunity. No. You have to put racial stuff all over the place and racial identity consciousness on everything to slow everything down and to stop everything from functioning. So that you can't actually have signaling in a market that actually allows people to get into contracts that work for both buyer and seller of labor, for instance. So we never get an organic ladder to success. We never get an organic ladder to development. It just doesn't occur because it can't. It's been stamped out by this ideological bent that is just completely obsessed with its own radical view of how progress happens through cannibalism of identity, through that you have to take and redistribute. And so you've got this state which is geared essentially to take and redistribute. And so obviously if you can't redistribute evenly to everyone, and it has to go to the identity, well, it has to go to a token. It has to go to someone who is going to get it because of the systemic oppression. So you have to find an address of who to send the benefit to, the special privilege to, the ideological privilege that makes up for the unjust conspiracy against their identity. And so who ends up being the beneficiary? The black plutocratic elite. They complain about white monopoly capital, but I don't hear them complaining about the secret black political monopoly corruption. There's no speak of that because it can't exist according to the ideology, or it only exists because we don't have people who are radically believing enough that if we had a more radical government, then that kind of corruption wouldn't take place, or it would be irrelevant somehow. It always just doubles down on its own depravity, on its own destabilization of everything as the solution to anything. Because it can't be intelligent and honest and authentic that its policy is the failure. It is the moral corruption that produces the state corruption. It is state corruption in a shell. It is a totalitarian runaway culture that is incapable of even being honest about its own failings and about even developing real intelligence about its own mismanagement, because it is wedded to its moral corruption. And so you have these pundits and you have these people who are spewing this agenda, and that's what they do. That's what they're good at, and they're natural fascists. And that's what journalism has become now. It's become these field marshals with their moral self-righteousness and sanctimoniousness. And the sad thing is, maybe I sound sanctimonious calling it out, but the sad thing is that it's so toxic it has to be called out. It has to be pointed out. Because it's taken over. it has become the orthodoxy, and to the extent to which it's not being confronted like a sacred cow, you know, it's only going to get worse. It's only going to cause more disruption and essentially the slow march to overt fascism, because morally it has already taken over. Even if you can say, well, you know, the people who are running the system, you know, they're trying to play both sides. They're trying to pander to everyone or something like that because it's so in vogue, it's so fashionable, it's so popular, and it holds so much cultural power. I mean, as it exists as the cultural hegemon, you know, there is no hope essentially, and in some sense, to the extent to which that culture has not been able to sort itself out, we deserve the government that we get. Uh, we deserve this kind of mediocrity. We deserve to fail as a lesson in history to that when you entertain this kind of moral corruption, these are the consequences. Uh, you know, it's the kind of mob mentality that I guess also got rid of Thabo Mbeki and installed Zuma. You know, because the leaders of that angry mob were not happy with Thabo Mbeki admitting his mistake and changing the policy. He still had to go. I mean, to the extent to which that leadership of those activist movements, you know, I mean, you know, they get a taste of blood and they're calling for blood and I mean, that has essentially been the slow transition in politics is to mob rule. Um, because when you have that kind of abject activism, which is not interested in actually engaging in politics, they just have demands and they want to be treated as a certain sort of identity. I mean, in some sense, I mean, like on that issue, perhaps not unjustifiable because this was, let's say, almost a non-political issue. It was a health issue or something like that. But something that is a moral issue, um, that's part of a sophisticated political claim that has essentially just taken over whole swaths of the cultural apparatus, of journalism, of the gatekeeping function, of institutional bureaucracies and administrations. Um, yeah, I mean, the octopus and its tentacles have just gotten a hold of everything. Yeah, is it possible even to have it be undone? I doubt it. It'd be interesting if alternatives can. I mean, I have hoped that Redi Dereko would make her own radio station and be an alternative to the kind of the disgusting fascism that comes from 567 medium wave Cape Talk. That essentially will never be confronted. You know, where is that being challenged in the public sphere? And I mean, the perfect analogy of the non confrontation with the ideological line and dogma of the anti racism, black power movement, or whatever it wants to label itself, social justice, you know, it's taken on all these tags. I mean, a wonderful metaphor for that to explore the kind of how it operates is you just look at how the COVID crisis has been covered by journalists, you know, and how the propaganda for the crisis and the moral panic and the hysteria is just, you know, everything is just awash with it. You know, there's no investigation. There's no one explores the difference between a case fatality rate from a pandemic or from a virus or disease and incidence fatality. And so you've got this collection of this essentially meaningless statistic of confirmed cases that sort of suggests that incidence fatality means anything. You know, sort of that is just the implicit assumption which no one digs beneath, that no one is willing to question out loud, that no one is willing to talk about, as this completely irresponsible statistic is published by government sources and journalists run with it, you know, without critical thinking, without investigation, because, you know, the only critical thinking that they can do is when they are attacking the detractors of the ideological narrative, essentially. You know, that's how they prove that they are worthy field marshals of this agenda, essentially, and everything is just this conglomerated, sort of convoluted. You know, it's this interesting how the intelligentsia, or how this pseudo intellectual class sort of have this kind of intellectual conglomeration with political power. You know, that it's like a one party state. It's like a totalitarian system of culture, which we already have the cultural version, and it's already sort of corrupted much of policy and legal, you know, how law has been reinterpreted so that it can be commensurate with this kind of totalitarian corruption of the state. That you're allowed to treat people based on their group categorization. Uh, that it doesn't matter if you're disadvantaged or not. If you meet the superficial criteria, you know, it is the identity consciousness cult, and you know, and has just has been morally sanctioned by state power, and then you just get these journalists who just go along with it, and well they heralded it. To a large extent they were the ones who essentially pushed for it, because this disgusting oversimplified, um, I mean, I guess, you know, because essentially they could interview academics who had titles, you know, who were credentialed in some sense, and because they got a pass, because it's so hard to challenge something that labels itself anti-racism. It's so hard to dig underneath the superficial and vacuous intellectual mediocrity, you know, and you know, this is how fascist intellectual structures have always promulgated themselves. They just always abrogate all the positive labels for themselves. You know, this is why the Nazis used red on their flag, is because they wanted to sell themselves as socialists. That's what they do. They just appropriate things. They just relabel things. They just change the meaning of the language. You know, they just rewrite everything, uh, and just make them, and they just identify themselves as being the good people. I mean, I'm sure the Nazis also would have described themselves as being pro social justice, because they were against the conspiracy against their people, just as the conspiracy of white privilege functions in this current disgusting totalitarian cult. And when does it get challenged? When does it even have to substantiate itself? I mean, obviously, if it was called to substantiate itself, if it had to withstand comedic uh, uh, inspection, you know, I mean, this is why I think it also is so humorlessness, or humorless, because it cannot withstand any kind of critical thinking that doesn't already take on board all of its presumptions. And all of its presumptions are so fundamentally arbitrary, just to give itself this predictive machine that it is allowed essentially to know your intention by some superficial symbolic epistemic conduciveness that they can say, well, you are this color, therefore this is true about you, and this is true of the role that you must play in order to help fix the system. It's sort of it's so prescriptive in that sense, uh, in a quite an in quite a morally unjustifiable and sickening way that's completely illiberal. But no one stands up for the principles of liberty as the Constitution has been reinterpreted to betray those principles, um, and radically reinterpreted in ways that are completely nonsense, because the whole intellectual edifice of anti-racism is complete nonsense. I mean, it's just a grand narrative that if you don't agree with fully, you are branded a racist. I mean, that's as far as their argument goes. They'll just call you willfully ignorant, as they don't step into the arena, as they don't contend any of their claims honestly and authentically with any kind of intellectual good faith or intellectual charity. It's just a blanket claim that they just table thump. And the kind of evidence that they have, which is so cherry picked, the history that they use is so stereotyped, is so typecast into just a grand generalization. It's pathetic. It really is pathetic and disgusting. If you essentially want to, I mean, their treatment of history is just, it's so sophomoric. It is pathetic that you can, I mean, and the things that exist in the present which break that mold, which break that interpretation, well, it's still good enough for them. It doesn't matter that black plutocrats can use the poor as a shield in order to continue the corruption that never ends, that can never even be detected under this ideology. Because it's so fixated on its sort of identity cannibalism of redistribution. There's also another important point here that yes, that the you see the reason why their ideology is so appealing is because it does offer to its adherents this reliable, dependable, predictable way of attaching labels to people and being able to essentially ascribe to people intentionality and motivation. They can see into your heart. They have this kind of telepathy and foresight. It's sort of I mean, I would call it archetypally. The kind of the ideology of the false prophet. That they have these promises about the future, and the means will always justify the ends. Um, but to put a finer point on it, um, in terms of how the emotional argument works, and it is quite disgusting, is essentially that if they essentially get away, because you see, they're not just calling people prejudiced, they're also insulting them. They're intrinsically attacking people's dignity. So that not only are they making this grand argument that people are systemically prejudiced and that they are systemically racist. So they're calling people racist, but then they are also insulting them on top of that. They are making a swipe at their dignity. And because essentially they're doing both of those things at the same time, if you defend yourself against this disgusting claim, then they will say that you are trying to be a judge in your own court and you're trying to defend yourself. You're just trying to defend yourself. You're being self-interested because you're just defending yourself against this claim. So essentially, because they add the ad hominem layer and they essentially impugn your motivation and they impugn you with a kind of bad faith, fundamental claim of bad faith. If you try to resist them intellectually, then essentially they brand you as a kind of tyrannical evil force because you won't accept your collective guilt and you won't engage in the project of this kind of retributivistic shame that is part of the process of repair and healing or something like that. It's got this really strange kind of, that you are an insect that is a member of your hive, and it's only when the hive's reach this separate but equal development, kind of Nazi philosophy of ethnocentric, calibrated and measured, proportional representation of equity and diversity. It's got this really demeaning and dehumanizing reduction of humanity into the moral consideration which is vested only in the group, and the individual is merely a pale reflection of the moral consideration that is primarily vested in the group and the ethnicity or the so it's got fundamentally this poison, this Nazi philosophy baked into it right at the core. I mean, it is fascism. It's much less like the kind of Marxist Leninism and it's not like vanguardism that Lenin essentially orchestrated under fake ideological labels. It's much it's the same animal as Nazism. It's just got slightly different mythology. It's just got slightly different narrative, but it's exactly the same functioning apparatus and totalitarian structure. And so it's very interesting because they ironically say that they are against the fascists and they want to go and punch Nazis, when it's so ironic that essentially we are reliving through Weimar Germany 1920s, and these are the people who ostensibly are against fascists, but they are literally the reincarnation of the fascists. And you can see, just the kind of the moral question: if you lived in a society, would you be opposed to the fascists? This is the actual answer to that hypothetical question in moral philosophy. It's like it's not even different. It's not. This is the actual. We're living in that hypothetical. That hypothetical is the reality of today, and we can see where the chips stand. We can see the lay of the land, and we can look at the perpetrators, and we can look at those who have not confronted these disgusting arguments, that have not tracked the principles, who have just gotten onto the bandwagon even though it has no intellectual substantiation or grounding. You can talk to the moral philosophy people that are behind this movement, or let's say adjacent to this movement, and they are happy to try to essentially prospectively try to reverse engineer justification for the movement because they are on board. They don't want to lose their seat as part of the brain of this animal. They see themselves as important. They lend their credentials to the movement as they are part of this unfinished project that is still trying to effectively work out the details of the Führer principle, essentially, as they corrupt all their own philosophy in some sense. Epistemological responsibilism has very good structures within it, which would essentially point at how essentially this epistemic conduciveness is the poison in this whole movement, essentially. How it's sort of trying to use history as a data point of epistemic conduciveness, which essentially poisons the whole thing. But because they've adapted epistemic responsibilism into knowledge communities and stuff like that, they've actually got an unfinished formula of how you can essentially try to extract epistemic injustice into a form in which it can be used as a general justification for this disgusting movement, when it's quite obvious that epistemic injustice is something that is unquantifiable. It's something that cannot be recontacted, because if the truth has been unjustly treated, it's the treatment that the truth has borne, and the truth is not is not something that can be compensated for in another form. The idea that, I mean, how are you going to transcribe epistemic injustice into a process of reconciliation? It's got nothing to do with epistemic injustice at that point. I mean, how would you ever repay epistemic injustice? And obviously, their solution is disgusting. It is that, well, you have to maim the other party. You have to hurt. You have to redistribute the pain and the hurt and make it equal. You have to sort of create a ledger and say, well, if this happened to the one side, then it must, and it was a negative because and it was epistemically, and it did harm to epistemic justice, then epistemic injustice must then be done on the other side. So that is its solution, is two wrongs make a right. It's fucking disgusting. And this is the kind of retributivistic, monstrous, sadistically edged, which is, it's even present in their emotional opening gambit, which is that they will call you prejudiced and they will insult you. It's very clearly a sadistically edged ploy, because if they can land that initial blow and if it can be respected as part of the discourse, they've effectively implanted their disgusting premise right at the core, and you know, they've done it right at the start, you know, and essentially if you let them be respected in making that initial move, which is fundamentally an affront to human dignity, essentially, that essentially they're making a claim about reality that you are going to be responsible for resolving, and until you do, your dignity is demeaned. And essentially that is the structure in which genocide becomes viable. That is the kind of complaint in which you can do anything, in which the power of the state can be solicited and cultivated into, because essentially if that is your moral position, and you want to have that moral position eventually reflected into the law itself, which it has already gotten its hands into infiltrating. The policy on the books, the law on the books, is fundamentally unconstitutional. It's fundamentally a betrayal of the values. But as essentially, you know, it's been a slow cook process. And we've got identity consciousness effectively in the law. We've got this fascistic mentality that has already been legally validated, essentially. You know, it's the Constitution stands betrayed. It stands dead. The question is, can it be resurrected? And there's hardly the political will to confront on this level. There's hardly, you know, and this requires real leadership. This requires making the polemic and defending it, and overtly holding that line and that moral line, and connecting the morality, the points on the morality to the practical ones. Because essentially, if you use identity as a proxy for and which is connected to the systemic oppression bullshit, you can't actually deal with disadvantage, and you will forever be giving benefits to people who are privileged. You'll be creating an ideological privilege to supposedly compensate people for their lack of systemic privilege. And so you'll create this political privilege, and essentially that's what we have existing already, essentially. And this is why the state can't use its resources effectively and properly, because it's not targeting disadvantage. It's not allowed to, in essence. It has to just target the identity, which means you have to find tokens. And if you are finding tokens to be beneficiaries, you are fundamentally destabilizing the whole system. You're robbing the system of having actually any kind of real signaling. It can't signal between buyers and sellers. It can't maintain markets that can actually expand opportunity and organically develop, because it can only develop from the ideological framework of this top-down imposed quota system or whatever. that is just completely surreal. It's completely disorientating, constantly. And the only way that you can orientate yourself is if you adopt their identity consciousness and their argument of systemic oppression. And once you're in that mind space, there's no more opportunity anymore. There's just cannibalism. It's just a zero-sum game of a shrinking pie as government seizes control of more things and gets its hands into more things and tries to administer more things so that it can pretend to be the hero of the story as it continues to destroy and disrupt and destabilize. And so we've got this engine of illiberal fascistic mentality, and there's no end in sight, and there's no confrontation, and there's no real response in culture to claw back what has been taken and stolen. And journalism itself is fundamentally filled with vacuous, sycophantic people who care more about appeasing the mob and catering to the mob and pandering to the mob and being part of that groupthink. And yeah, I mean, obviously it's a depressing situation. Essentially, there's no integrity, and it's too hard to have integrity on a public level. Essentially, the cost is too high because the cultural hegemon is just so toxic. And even the business model of this toxic system that is supplanting anything that actually functions in a genuine or in an authentic way has this disgusting sort of virtue signaling aspect to it, where it can it's very easy to play the game. It's very easy to sort of to pander to it. It's too easy in some sense. This is why it facilitates general, essentially psychopathic CEOs can very easily play this game. It's too easy to do. You just find some witch hunt to join. You help throw someone under the bus, and there you go. And then you get a pass. So it's like, you just join in the mob witch hunts, and that's all you have to do. And so you never make any real progress on any real tangible thing that'll make a difference in anyone's life, other than just making the whole system worse off, making everything work worse. And that supposedly is good, because you're helping to disrupt, and you're helping the revolutionary cause in some sense. You're essentially helping for a full-blown fascist to clearly take power and to implement a more radical agenda in which they have their hands over the legal apparatus, over the state power, and essentially they can flip the switch and put it into a full-blown police state, which I would say in some sense, it's 5 minutes to midnight sort of thing. Maybe we're in like very early 1920s Weimar Germany. People forget that the Nazis actually didn't introduce Aryan studies into schools. That already occurred in Weimar Germany. And it's just the same with race and gender studies, how that has been injected into, well, I guess through teachers primarily, but through life skills. They're going to put this ideological indoctrination into the schools. It's yeah, I mean, I guess liberty, did it ever have a real opportunity to grow in this country before it was betrayed by corrupt and morally bankrupt people just looking for popularity and influence? With no reasoned integrity anywhere. It's become unfashionable to stand for something other than with the mob and pandering to more outrage. Okay, I'm just repeating repeating myself now. I guess I'll stop.